Good afternoon, students. Welcome to the Social Sciences content-based conduct sessions for the examinations 2021. I'm Mrs. Motowanaha, your tutor. I'm going to present to you what's going to happen in the question papers for 2021 social sciences. So each question paper for May, August, and November will be out of 130. Each question paper will be 3 hours long. There will be 4 questions for each question paper. Then you are expected to answer all questions. So you are provided with a study guide for social sciences by Iol. So make use of it for study purposes. What are you expected to know from Unit 1, which is teaching methodologies? The following topics should be considered. The teaching methods of history. What are the methods a history teacher should use whenever presenting his or her lesson? There are different types of methods that you should consider, including whenever you are teaching your history to your learners. You should also know the importances of pair work. In most cases, students get confused or do not know of what pair and group work is all about. So this is pair work but not group work. So you are required to know why pair work is important to incorporate whenever you are teaching history or giving activities to your learners as far as history concerns. You are also expected to know how maps, games, etc. make classroom environment conducive. So as a history teacher, one may decorate or may display or may include some kind of games to stimulate learners' interest for the subject, specifically history. Why are those maps that you display maybe on your walls of your classroom, the games that you may give to your learners, why are they important for the classroom conducive environment? You are also expected to know the values, the characteristics, and the role of a history teacher. Learning activities that support history, class environment, and elements of learner-centered education. As a history teacher, there are some characteristics that you portray. So you need to know those characteristics. You should point out, you should be able to explain those characteristics. You should also as well know the role a history teacher plays in the history or in teaching and learning as far as history concerns. You should, in this same sentence, you should also know or you should point out the learning activities that you as a history teacher incorporate in order to support or in order to make the learning or the classroom environment conducive. And the last and the most important point in this sentence is the elements of learner-centered education. For you to know the elements of learner-centered education, you should know what learner-centered education is all about. Learner-centered education is an approach. It's not a method. It's an approach to teaching and learning. So now what are those methods? What are those elements associated with this learner-centered education approach? How do you deal as a history teacher? How do you deal with multicultural learners? As you know, any teacher, whether history, geography, any Namibian, any teacher, even worldwide, deals with different learners from different cultural backgrounds. For example, you find in your class you have Oshibambo speaking kids, you have Herero speaking learners, you have Tamara Namas, you have whites, those of you who are working or teaching in towns, you have whosoever you can name them. You have also learners from different countries. Now, these learners, they form, part of your class. How do you address issues? For example, in history, we teach topics like apartheid. We talk of white implementing these apartheid policies in Namibia, for example. You have white kids in your class. How do you talk about these sensitive issues? Since you have white kids, for example, because they are coming from that different backgrounds, they are not blacks. How do you deal with such sensitive issues? What do you do when you are for example, introducing cultural dances or performances or any culture of other learners? Just to mention a few, how do you deal with these learners from different cultural background? What is that you have to bear in your mind? What is that you have to do to these kids in order to make sure that you put all learners' considerations or interest into considerations? The last one on this Unit 1 is the basic components of a lesson plan. The word sounds, or the term basic component sounds easy, but many a times teachers fail to bring about these basic components. What is that you need to do or to go about in a lesson plan? For example, the duration of your lesson. Many a times teachers do not include this duration. For me to see the content or to master or to see how much you're going to give to the learners, it should be determined by the time. Because if you are going to teach about a lot of things, it should be shown in the duration there of how many minutes you are going to give or to present your lesson. So some of the basic components, that's why we are saying basic components. There are some components that you should not exclude from a lesson plan. So there's basic things we need to include them in our lesson plans. Because for us to know how much content we're going to give to the learners or to how much content we are including in our lessons, it will be determined by the duration, the minutes or hours you are going to spend for that specific lesson. In Unit 2, it's about Namibian history. You are required to know what the contract labor system is all about. Knowing the contract labor system includes also how this contract labor system was practiced by the whites in Namibia. Who were those people who were contracted in this labor system? The effect the contract labor system had on the workers themselves as well as the entire Namibian nation. including the family. So you should know how it affected the workers and how it also affected the entire Namibian nation at large. Now, we should also look at whether people have benefited from this contract labor system or they did not benefit at all, and make sure that everything has got advantages and disadvantages. The second point that we should know about the Windhoek massacre. What is a massacre? What is Windhoek massacre? You should know about this. What happened? What are the reasons for Windhoek massacre? You have to know about that. How did Windhoek massacre take place? You should know about this. When did Windhoek massacre take place? You should know about this. And what are the results or the consequences of Windhoek massacre? Windhoek massacre is a broad term, but that is just in nutshell about the massacre itself. There are also some other things that have to do with Windhoek massacre. For example, when this old location people were told to move to Katutura, they have refused. You should know the reasons why they refused to move to Katutura. You should also know about the role played by the independent churches towards the Namibian independence. For you to be able to know, find out about this role, you should first ask yourself, what are the independent churches? Why were these independent churches established? Because if you know the reasons why these independent churches were established, you should be able as well to know the role played by these churches towards the Namibian independence. In another word, or in short, what is that these churches do as far as Namibian independence concerns? In addition to the independent churches, we also have a referendum that was held by one of the independent churches, which is Iol. So this specific church, under Bishop Leonard Awala, they held a referendum. Now, you should know what this Iol referendum was all about. You should know how this referendum went about. You should know the reactions of Namibian people towards this referendum. In another word, what were the results of this Iol referendum? And after they have held an Iol referendum, they have written what was known as open letters. How you should know what open letters were all about, the content of these open letters. In addition to the open letters, you should also know pastoral letters, because we cannot separate open and pastoral. We cannot we cannot put them, we have to deal with them together because they almost talk about the same thing. What did Namibian people think about these open and pastoral letters? As far as apartheid concerns, was implemented in Namibia, in 1964, there came a plan that was called an Odendaal Plan, where the South African colonial administrations made sure the apartheid policies were put into practice in 1964. As far as this plan concerns, there were economic and political recommendations made. Now find out how these recommendations affected the Namibian people. Which of these recommendations were were benefiting the Namibians, and which of these recommendations impacted the lives of Namibian people. In another word, what did Namibian people think or feel about this Odendaal plan in particular? The last point you should know in this Namibian history is a resolution 435 and the independence. What was the resolution 435? What were the points, or what were the terms of the resolution 435, and how this resolution 435 contributed to the Namibian independence? In Unit 3, this is where you find all matters pertaining to African history. So in African history, you should know or study about the OAU, the Organizations of African Unity. What is that is required of you to know about the Organizations of African Unity? You should know the aims, the year of establishment. Those are the basic things, though it's not indicated here. By knowing the aims, you should now look at the bodies that made up the structure of the OAU. For example, the Assembly, the Council of Ministers, just to mention a few. Now, the structure or the bodies that made up the structure of the OAU, the specific bodies, they have specific functions. You should also look at the functions of these bodies. I've only given 2 examples, but there are a lot of bodies that made up the structure of the Organizations of African Unity. Apart from knowing the bodies that made up the structure of the Organizations of African Unity, you should also know the successes and the failures of the Organizations of African Unity. As far as African history concerns as well, you should know the economic systems in Africa. This time around, I have given the examples of those economic systems, which is capitalism, socialism, and mixed economic system. Why did I do this? Because many a times students always have problems of, whenever they are asked about economic systems, they give answers like democracy. Democracy is not part of the economic systems. You should differentiate between political things or systems and economic. Economic systems is how the economies of African continent or African countries were being run or still being run. For example, Namibia is practicing a mixed economic system. Other countries like Kenya is practicing capitalism. Tanzania, socialism. You know, we have those concrete examples in our books, in our study guides. So now, what is it that you have to know about these economic systems? Find out the basic characteristics of each economic system. You should also know or find out how these economic systems affected the African people. Specifically, in those examples you are given, like what I've said, mixed economic system in Namibia and Zambia, socialism in Tanzania, capitalism in Kenya. Now, after African countries got their independence, they experienced what we call economic crisis. Now, here we should know the measures to combat the economic crisis in Africa. For example, the Lagos Plan. Now, you will not be able to know about this Lagos Plan if you do not know what economic crisis is all about. So for you to know these measures to combat means to overcome, you should be able to know first what this economic crisis are all about. A crisis is an ongoing problem. You try to solve it by bringing another problem. It's like, there is this problem, you try to borrow money to solve this problem, and then you, by borrowing, you're also creating another problem of what? Of debts. Just an example. Now, Lagos Plan was one of the measures to overcome this economic crisis. So you should know what Lagos Plan was all about. Let's move on to SADC, Southern African Development Community. You should know when it was established, member countries, the member states. You should know its aims, and those member countries, they had also functions. They had specific functions to carry. So you should also know about, for example, I'm just giving you one example of Namibia, that was to look after the fisheries and the marine resources. You should also know, as far as African history concerns, know the forms of government in Africa and their effects to the African people. What are the examples of forms of government? This has to do with politics, like what I've said earlier. Differentiate between political and economic affairs. This has to do with politics. What are these forms of government? For example, democracy. Namibia has practiced democracy. Some countries like Zaire, we had a dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko. That was now before they moved towards democracy. So we have examples of one of forms of government in Africa is dictatorship. Now, what are the effects of this? Those are just examples that I've given you. You have all the notes in your study guides. How do this democracy, dictatorship, you can name them, etc., how do they affect the African people? And the last point here in the African history is on the apartheid laws that were introduced for black people in South Africa. What were these laws that were introduced for black people in South Africa? You should be able to know all the laws, how these laws were conducted or introduced for blacks, and the effects each law had on the black people, specifically in South Africa. The last unit, which is Unit 4, is on world history. Now, what is that you should know in the history of the world? You should know the aims of Hitler. We know Hitler is one of the greatest leaders during those years in Germany. Hitler, you cannot separate Hitler from the Nazi. The Nazi is the party. The leader of the Nazi party, the leader was Hitler. So now, you have to wind up to put up these two together. Whenever we are talking of Nazi Party, we are talking of Hitler. What were Hitler's aims? If we are asking about Hitler's aims, we are asking about the Nazi aims. In the Nazi rule now, the effects of Nazi rule, the effects of Hitler's rule in Germany. In another word, what did the people of Germany, or people even in the world, think or feel about this Nazi rule? There were some people that were happy about it. Some people were not, they were just doing things because they were afraid. So you should be able to evaluate the effect of Nazi rule in Germany and also Europe, because this Nazi rule or Hitler's aims or Hitler's rule, it also affected peace in the world. Okay? We should also know about communism in China. So for you to know how communism was practiced in China, you should first know or the definition or the meanings of the word itself, communism. Now, don't forget that communism is affiliated by Cold War. So this you find it in the Cold War history or chapter. Now, if you know about the history of Cold War, you'll be able to know about this communism. Find out about the features of communism. How was this communism practiced in China? In addition to this, you should also know how this communism now, when it was practiced in China, how did it affect the Chinese people? Not only the Chinese people, but also people in the world or in Europe specifically, because how this communism was practiced in China, it also ended up affecting other countries. Third point there is about the United Nations organization. When was the United Nations organization established? You should know the year of establishment of the United Nations organization. You should know the aims. Apart from the aims, you should know the bodies that made up the structure of the United Nations organization. Not only knowing the bodies, but you should also know the aims or the functions of these bodies. For example, we have the General Assembly. You should know what that specific body consists of. You should know, in another word, what is made up of. You should know the functions, the main aim of that. What is that General Assembly, for example, does as far as the United Nations aims concerns. The fourth point there is on the fascism in Italy. The Benito Mussolini's party, the Fascist Party. Just a little bit of the history of it. How was it established? And how its leader now, Benito Mussolini, executed his power over the Italian people. And this fascism, we should also look at the effect it had on the Italian people specifically, and also the world at large. Remember, this fascism did not only affect the Italian people, but also the world, because this Benito Mussolini, there was a point where he invaded other countries where he caused a lot of distractions on the economies of those specific countries, and also resulting into what? Into a lot of lives being lost in those countries. That's why we are saying the effect here, it's not only based on the Italian people, but also find out how this fascism affected other people in the world. Second last point here is on the establishments of the IMF and the World Bank. Many a times students ask questions like, what is IMF and the World Bank? Let me just get into this. Why are we having IMF and the World Bank together? It's not IMF or, but it's IMF and the World Bank together. These are, we can say it's two in one. It's one of the agencies of the United Nations organization. But these two, the work they do, it's almost the same. The functions of these two, it's almost the same. IMF cannot do on its own without the World Bank. So you should know now what this IMF, why were IMF and the World Bank established? And due to the main aim, let me just get into details a little bit. The main aim of IMF stands for International Monetary Fund. So, and the World Bank. This is it consists of the experts in finances, and the bank, that's the one that gives now the finances or the funds. Now, this bank, it's not a bank where an individual, somebody banks his money. This is the World Bank. This is the bank of the world, where countries, they don't bank their money, but actually they get some loans in order to do what? To rebuild their economies whenever they are affected by these problems. So, there are some conditions now for one to borrow money from this bank. Now, you should be able to evaluate whether countries in the world have benefited or have met these conditions of the IMF and the World Bank. You should evaluate whether this IMF and the World Bank were really getting the interest of these countries in the world, into practice. There are some countries who have benefited nicely from this IMF and the World Bank. Think of poor countries. Connect these poor countries to the conditions set by the World Bank and the IMF. So you should be able to find out, if you happen to be asked questions like, what did the countries in the world think or feel about this IMF and the World Bank? There was a structural adjustment programs introduced by this IMF and the World Bank. The last point here, the world history, is on the economic and regional organizations in the world. Now, what do we mean by these economic and regional organizations in the world? These are the organizations that were specifically set up for maybe a specific reasons, like economic reasons, or for a specific region. For example, we have SADC, that was only formed for Southern African countries, those countries that are only at the specific regions of Africa, the southern part. We have OPEC, countries that had interest in the oil the oil producing countries. It's for that specific economic reasons for producing oil. We have Comecon. It was also set up for giving aid. Those mostly the communist countries were aiding one another. So it's an economic reason. So now, what is expected from you? You should know the aims of these economic and regional organizations. I have just given 3 examples, but there are a lot. You should know all of them. So you should know the aims. You should know the member countries. You should know the specific, for example, specific functions of specific countries. Like, for example, in SADC, like what I've said earlier, SADC, Namibia is given a responsibility of fisheries and marine resources. Now, evaluate if those countries, the responsibilities given to them, they have fulfilled them or not. This is the end of presentation. Good luck.